Right, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Women in Localization in partnership with one of our Gold Global sponsors, MasterWord Services. Just a few housekeeping items. And today's call is being recorded. This recording will be available to our Women in Localization members via the member portal. If you are familiar with Women in Localization, our mission is to foster a global community for the advancement of women in the localization industry. Women in Localization is an inclusive organization and welcomes anyone as a member. If you're not already a member, it's super easy to become one and it's free, and you can get started on the Women in Localization website. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature found in the menu bar below. And without further ado, we're going to get started right away. So it's my pleasure to hand it over to our speakers for this insightful presentation.
Well, I am very, very excited and grateful to be able to have this conversation with Melody Meyer, who currently serves as an executive, as a director on the boards of British Petroleum, ABV, National Oil Well, and a startup company, Energy Internet Corporation. She retired from Chevron after 37 years, and after becoming one of the very first women at Chevron and one of the very first women in the industry to become actually president of an oil and gas corporation, president of Chevron Asia Pacific, and previously president of Chevron Energy Technology Company, which is incredible. If anybody is familiar with the oil and gas industry, it's still even today mostly male dominated. So Melody, you went from being a college graduate with a degree in mechanical engineering who never even flown an airplane, to working on projects in Africa, across Asia, to becoming a president of 2 Chevron companies, and now serving on British Petroleum's board. So from your perspective, from the woman herself, who is Melody Meyer?
Thank you, Mila, and thank you to everyone who's calling in or watching later. It's an honor to speak to you, and I admire your organization. And as someone who has had the opportunity to work in projects or operations in 19 countries around the world, what you do has really made a huge impact on my career success in partnership with translation and localization. So a little bit about who I am. I'll start with a tiny bit of background on my career and then a bit about my leadership. So as Mila said, I came in as a young engineer, not knowing the world, very soon on a business trip to Angola. Never been on an airplane, never been out of the country, never been in a communist country in a camp guarded by Cuban guards with automatic weapons. And I was a young woman alone on a business trip in a very male-dominated industry. But I've had a wonderful career in this industry, having started in that international space and working in many countries around the world and also in the US. I've learned that, resilience and adaptability were really important in my career, and also being able to solve some complex problems with some strong leadership skills that as a woman I had to develop on my own, because the leadership skills in my industry 44 years ago were not the kind of leadership skills that I wanted to have in the industry. So I had to develop my own. So a couple thoughts about my leadership. So I was someone always in my career who worked very hard to create value for my company. I didn't focus on my career success, but I always wanted the company to succeed and be successful. So being very value-driven was a big part of my career success. And I would say, secondly, I have been in opportunities or projects or assignments that were marked by a lot of change. Major mergers, being in new startup countries, having crises occur and having to manage those. And one of the leadership attributes that was so important to me is what I call creating advantage from change, which means when change happens in your business, your operation, your life, whatever, instead of rebuilding or restoring just to have the same performance you had before, I would try to proact and come up with very innovative new ways to run the business or position the business that created advantage. So that was something that was a real important part of my career, is this creating advantage from change. And then lastly, two other things I'll say is that I've been a leader that always values the contributions of everyone. The places where I've worked do not work without every single person giving their 100%. And that's translation, that is, running the day-to-day operations behind the scenes, food and transport and the engineers and the lawyers. I mean, it takes everyone. And I always valued those contributions. And then lastly, when I have to say, who am I? I married my high school sweetheart. He has been my most tremendous supporter and rock, been very important for our career success, because I couldn't do what I did around the world without him. I went about 8 years working rotations, where I worked 28 days in Kazakhstan, 28 home, and then 28 days Angola and home. And we had 3 young children, ages 3, 6, and 8 at the time. So having that wonderful partner for life has been incredible. So being a wife, a mother, I'm a grandmother now, I have 4 amazing grandchildren, and friends and family. And those of you who integrate your career with your family know how important it is to have those friends and family support to be successful. So that's a little bit of a snapshot, Mila, as to who I am.
Thank you. And so invaluable. Our industry, and I think the world, is going through a lot of change right now. So I wrote it down: creating advantage from change. I think many of us may want to kind of rethink how we look at change based on that. So Melody, what were the most meaningful milestones in your career?
I think several different ones. So I had the opportunity to work on 3 new startup countries. These are countries that didn't have foreign investment or even oil and gas operations in their country before we entered. So this was with Chevron, and the first one was offshore China in the South China Sea. I was involved in the startup of the first offshore development in the Pearl River Mouth Basin, and that was really an incredible opportunity for me to negotiate with the Chinese and to start something that was very creative. I brought some ideas forward that we were able to use and enhance the economics of that project, which was probably the earliest lesson for me to understand how a single person could create more value by doing something different. And that led to another startup, which was in Papua New Guinea. This was a country that had no oil and gas development. I was on the ground floor team working to get this project going. We had 5 partners, we had multiple languages. But in Papua New Guinea, that was the project that a single individual and I working together transformed that project from a low return to a very high return project. And it became a basis for how do you integrate all of the disciplines around a project to create value. And when we executed that project, it was done extremely well. We captured the value. We were written up in Jared Diamond's book called Collapse around the things we did in that country that were so positive. And then lastly, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was the first ever largest joint venture in the former Soviet Union. We were there just as the Soviet Union was breaking up. Kazakhstan was a new country. I went there on 28-28 rotation, trying to put this operation together in 5 languages and work the contracts and negotiations. So those 3 startups were really milestones for my career. But then the one more that I'll mention, and I call it my start over, which was I was running the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans, and we were the largest producer offshore, and we had hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which those of you in the US would know were devastating. And we had to completely rebuild our company. And this was the time that I really learned this creating advantage from change, because we weren't a high performing business before the storms. but we consciously decided to become a very high-performing business after the storms, and we rebuilt in that way, and it was very successful. And then lastly, as I ran Asia, as the president of Chevron Asia Pacific, we had some of the largest capital investments in Australia and in China, and some of the largest operations in the company. And just that was a capstone opportunity to use my leadership in those new growth areas. So I think those were defining moments for me in the industry, just to create the value-driven and the creating advantage from change. And then always trying to be a strong leader for my team and with my employees.
So you're mentioning countries, China, Kazakhstan, Angola, countries that probably don't shine in the world as the most with the most advantages or advancements of women in the society. When did you realize, and how did it happen, that other women started looking up to you as a leader, as a role model? And how did you do that?
So it's a good question, because I was always just heads down, focused on my work and, my team and what we were accomplishing. And I was always the only woman in the room, but I never thought of myself as a role model. And when I was in Kazakhstan, I had a large team. I was production, the manager of operations engineering. So I had all of the engineers, the scientists, the construction teams. I gave a big town hall to my group. And after the town hall, all of the Russian and Kazakh women who were trained as engineers alongside their male counterparts, but at the time, back in the early 90s, they never had a chance to work as real engineers. They were working as technicians. So many of these women followed me back to my office after the town hall, closed the door, and I thought, gosh, I must have struck a nerve with them. But what they did is they said, look, now that we're part of Chevron, will we have the opportunity to do what you do? And I said, absolutely. And they said, would you teach us? And it was the first time in my life that I realized that I was being looked at as a role model. And I took it very seriously from that moment forward. I figured if I was being viewed as one, I wanted to be a really good role model, and I wanted to help other women. And I've made that extremely important. Later I was asked to be the executive sponsor of the Chevron Women's Network. This was when it was just first being conceived. I said no at first because early in my career, when women got together, there were so few of us that our male counterparts thought it was distrusted. They distrusted what we were talking about. But the concept of the network was to be an inclusive network for everyone. And as I saw what their objective was, I said, I'm 100% in. And I'm a huge advocate for the advancement of women. I mentor a lot of women. I was co-leading women corporate directors here in Houston. I'm on a McKinsey advisory board on advancing women. I coach women about getting on boards now. So I've just taken that job as a role model very seriously.
Wow, what a story. So one of the things that I know you mentioned before, confidence, right? Confidence is also often brought up in conversations about women and women being successful. What does confidence mean to you? And what role does confidence play in one's career and success?
I think it's very important, but it has to be combined with humility, because we know there's a fine line between confidence and ego and confidence with humility. And I think that confidence with humility is very important. The confidence comes into many ways. And I know many women talk about the fact that their voices don't get heard in a meeting until a male colleague expresses the same opinion, and then everyone jumps on it and says yes. I think the confidence is to be prepared in a meeting, have your views ready, and if you're not heard, have the confidence to say, hang on, let me go at that again, or let me describe it better. Or if you see another woman bringing up an idea that isn't heard, to have the confidence to say, let's hear more. But I think the humility is important. And I also think having confidence also means you have to be confident as a strong communicator. Because I will tell you, when I came into this industry as a young engineer, I was so shy and nervous that I couldn't say my name without my heart pounding out of my chest. and I joined Toastmasters, which is an international organization. I started Toastmasters in many of the countries I worked in, because what it did for me is it just gave me the confidence to be able to to communicate well and to express my views concisely, and to be sure that I was heard. And I think it also made me a better listener. So I think confidence is important. Also, I would say that in my career, I got very little feedback, real feedback on how I could be better. So it's not, many people think they might have this imposter syndrome. What I did is I didn't get the feedback, but at the end of every year, I would think, what am I good at and what do I need to do better? And I would always try to find opportunities to learn things that I knew were important to my career. And for me as an engineer, it was things like, learning economics, learning financial statements, learning things that I knew later in my career that I would need, but I didn't know at the time. And then I'll say one more thing about confidence is, as the only woman in the room, I chose not to be a victim. And I think that's an intentional choice. There was bias that we all experience and that I experienced. And I chose not to be a victim. I just chose that, if there was bias expressed, that I would just work harder and smarter and prove the value that I could bring to the table. Of course, as I moved up in the organization, when I'd see bias, I would pick my battles wisely and make sure that I could help other people to eliminate that bias without having a chip on their shoulder or overreacting. Long time ago, women were perceived as being too sensitive when bias was expressed, but I think we have better tools today to say, hang on, time out. Maybe you didn't mean to express it that way. And because most male colleagues will not call their fellow colleagues out, but I think you can do it in a very polite way today to just say, hang on, I think you didn't mean it that way. And could you, share your views in a different way? But I think confidence is being able to speak up when you see it, do it in the right way where it's productive and constructive, and also just picking your own battles wisely. And very lastly, I would say, and I'm going a bit long on this, you have to have the confidence to take steps and actions, but also when they're wrong or that you learn from them, to be accountable and say, hey, made a mistake here, but here's what I learned and here's what I'm going to do differently. So it's a confidence to learn and take accountability and to adjust. And that goes over so well with any organization, because that's how we all learn. If you're working, you're going to make mistakes, and you have to be accountable for those and move on and learn from them.
Well, confidence is incredibly important in everything we do, because we also, know when the person is confident or insecure. So, but in addition to confidence, what other qualities are important?
So there's many, I think. And just yesterday, I finished the role as chair of my university, and the provost sent me a note. I'm going to read the quote she said to me, because it made me feel really good, and it actually describes another quality. Her quote was, "I'm inspired by your profound and graceful candor and your joy-filled seriousness and your willingness to share those gifts." And then I recall, after telling an organization once a big project they wanted to do, I told them no. And they came in later and they said, we all agreed that we've never felt so good about getting a no answer. And I said, why is that? And they said, because it's not a power play for you. It is, you express the rationale on what your decision is based on, and you're always focused on decision quality and risk, and not the power of just saying no. So I think the other quality is being, always happy but never satisfied, always wanting to be optimistic. And I actually got a button made one time that said always happy, never satisfied. But it's the optimism that we can always be better, but it's also the feeling that I'm not ever really satisfied. We have the opportunity to be better, and we're not the best yet. And I say another quality, Mila, is just using humor. I've been in so many weird and funny and done weird and funny things that, at the end of the day, you just have to laugh at yourself, or you have to use humor to defray a situation sometimes, to put it in perspective. And humor's been important in my career. And I think you can use it wisely and not frivolously, and it works for people.
And do those qualities apply regardless of where you're at? Because I see people here listening to us from Iraq, from California, from Portugal, Berlin, Canada, India, all over. So are these the qualities that are universally based on the global experience where you worked that are accepted in the industry?
Yes and no. I would say early on in Kazakhstan, as we used humor, our colleagues, our Kazakh and Russian colleagues, didn't understand our humor or the use of humor in the workplace. And in fact, as we all know, and you know better than anybody on localization, is that humor does not translate from country to country, and things that might be humorous to an American are not in India and not in Kazakhstan. And so it's a matter of finding that shared ground, but also appreciating the cultural differences and being able to listen to their use of humor in other countries, or how power and leadership translates differently in different countries. So I definitely think being a student of culture and cultural differences is a key to success. I would say one of my negotiations in China, one thing that I felt like I did fairly well is I could read the room, and I could read the room as to why we couldn't agree on a certain point. And I think that's a gift that if a business person doesn't have it, maybe the translation and localization team can help read the room to help someone understand what is the barrier to get to an agreement, and how do you overcome that barrier. And I think there's just a lot of opportunities there that are cultural that make a difference.
Well, thank you. I'm getting here a notebook of notes as I'm listening to you. Oil and gas industry doesn't really have the best perception today in the public view and the public eye. Of course, granted, we don't really know much about, what's really happening in the oil and gas industry. But do you feel that if the industry had more women in leadership 20, 30 years ago, the public perception of the industry would be different today?
I definitely do. And let me tell you why. I mean, I can't be more proud. I am so proud of my industry. I've worked with wonderful people across the globe who have shared values like mine. And I've worked for some tremendous male leaders that I admire and learn from. And I worked with some that I didn't admire, they were terrible. And I also learned from them on what not to do. But despite our success and despite all the things that we have done in our industry, I don't feel like we have been as good of listeners as we could have been on societal needs, on climate or the environment, on diversity and inclusion, on culture, and things that, we always seem to be a bit on our back foot, never on our front foot in some of these handling perception issues about our industry. And we often wait till society's kind of formed an opinion about us, and then we try to address it, and that's a bit late. So I think more women in leadership could have made a big difference in the past, because this is very stereotypical comment, but women bring very strong leadership, very, very strong smarts and brilliance, but also stronger skills of inclusion and communications, and often provide that good bridge between listening and communicating and helping to dispel the perceptions up front. So I encourage my women colleagues in the industry to be spokespeople, to speak up more about the industry and the positive things we do, and for our industry itself to tell our story better. But and I would say in the energy transition, which we started about 20 years ago, but we are really, really driving the transition today with the advancing lower carbon solutions. But I do think that women's voices in our industry today is such an imperative because we really need to communicate what we are doing. We're doing a lot to address societal needs, and we need to tell the story better.
And you're right. Outside of the industry, I think still a lot of communication needs to happen, and I think women do a much better job at that, telling it. So, how have you seen the movement, or some people would use the word fight? I like the word movement better, for women's access to leadership opportunities change from where your journey started to today?
It's changed a lot. 44 years ago, when I came into the industry as a young engineer, it wasn't reasonable for me to look up and see a woman leading, a line management part of the business. It was reasonable maybe to look up and see the head of HR or the head of legal or other staff roles to be female, but not as presidents of profit and loss divisions in our industry. But today it's really an imperative that we have those leaders. And while we've improved, we're not where we need to be. The statistics still show that we are the least diverse industry through numerous studies that have been done. We make progress, but it's small progress towards where we need. And what we often find in our industry is the pipeline is not very deep. You need, as we all know, a very deep entry-level diversity with women and other underrepresented areas of leadership. And then we need to be able to promote them equally through the system. But I would say the bigger challenge is to really make a step change to get closer to parity in our industry. We almost have to promote and advance women faster, and underrepresented groups faster than our male colleagues. Now that's a challenge, because the pipeline of wonderful male colleagues is deep, but our male colleagues have advanced preferentially over all of these years compared to their female colleagues. So there is a change, but I would say one of the biggest changes that I've observed, lastly, I'll say that for women, there was when women were advanced in my career moving up, they were often advanced in staff jobs, leading functional parts of the business, exploration or project change projects, that sort of thing. I fought very hard to stay in line management, which means you're running an operation. You have responsibility for profit and loss, you're running the business. And I had to fight hard to stay in that. And the pathway to CEO is for women who stay in the line management role, that don't move into the staff roles. And I think most companies now are realizing that they need to keep women in line management roles, that they can't move them off into staff jobs when they're high performers. And I think that change will make a difference going forward. But I'll say the biggest change I observed when I first came in the industry, there were so few women, and women were not very helpful to each other back then. There was a bit of tension, I would say, between the few women engineers and geologists and lawyers. But the biggest change I've observed is women helping other women. And I would say for all of you who work in a very male-dominated industry as well, that women helping other women is probably the single biggest impact we can all make to get women up into these roles that we need them to be in, to help them give the confidence too. Let's go back to the confidence. There's a view sometimes for women that they have this imposter syndrome, which I think men have it too, but I think women have it a bit more. And when you're asked to do something big, new, and different, women often think, I don't have all the skills, but that's the best time in your life to reach out to an advisor, find someone who can help you build your confidence. And often it would be another woman. I've reached out to women during my career, help you build that confidence to say, I may not have all the skills, but I am the best learner and I am the best leader for this job, and to get that confidence you need. So women helping other women will make a huge difference. And lastly, I think that another big change that I'm seeing is that companies are trying to change their culture. Our old command and control culture that used to be heavy in the oil and gas industry is much more inclusive and much more focused on decision quality, performance, and inclusivity. And that cultural change will help. Now, we have a ways to go. We still need to work on that, but the culture change is going to make a big difference, I think, with respect to not only getting women in the right leaders in the right job, but making sure that they can be successful when they get there.
I love it. It's not how much you don't know, it's how well you can learn. Kind of reframing from not how many times you fall, but how well do you get up? Not how much you don't know, but how well you can learn. That to me is, one of my takeaways from just right now. It's amazing. So great advice, great ideas. But what are some of the ideas and advice that you have seen promoted to women that may actually be harmful?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about harmful. I'm going to talk about advice as well. And when you ask this question, so sometimes I've had people come to me when they see a bias or see something happen and say, "You should speak up. You should speak up on that." And I had a vice chairman come to me once on something that he observed, and he said, "You should have spoken up on that." And I said, "Well, maybe you should have spoken up on that as well," because I think it's harmful. Like I said, with bias, is to appear too sensitive, or to appear that you might have a bit of a chip on your shoulder. But I do think it's important to encourage others to speak up, or to be that person that speaks up for others when you see it. And this gets back to my comment about when you see bias and maybe another woman's voice not heard in the room with a great idea, is to be the one to speak up and say, let's listen from her again. I think she had some great ideas. Let's give her some, an opportunity to go further with that. But I think it's harmful when you say, "Hey, wait a minute, you all didn't hear me. I want to say it again." So you have to be careful about speaking up for yourself and picking your battles wisely and to doing it right. I think another thing that's harmful is that sometimes women are promoted aggressively, but then not given the support they need in the job, or that there are maybe people that try to sabotage their success because they're jealous, or they don't think that they were the best qualified person for the job. And I think in those situations, if it happens, and I know it does happen often, for women and for other women, is to learn how to deal with that. Don't let it simmer in the background. Be upfront and transparent. It gets back to candor and transparency, and just say, "Hey, I don't feel like you're giving me the support, and why is that? I mean, what is it that I can do differently to get your support? And why aren't you supporting me, or why are you working against me?" Just take those opportunities privately to address those things, because you can't do it in the meeting. You can't do it in the moment. If people encourage you to, I'd say don't do it. I'd say do it behind the scenes. Also, responding to bias, I've talked a little bit about that. Women can do it respectfully and behind the scenes. But let me turn that around and talk about, how to be more successful as the only woman in the room with your ideas. First, it's so important to go into every room, every project, decision, meeting, particularly the big ones that are big decision meetings, is to be really well prepared and ready. And you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but you have to have thought deeply about the problem that you're trying to solve. And you have to have thought deeply about what are a number of options that I could bring to the table that could help solve that problem. And to be well equipped with ideas and to have thought of them in advance of showing up in the room makes a huge difference in what you can achieve in your job. And so sometimes I would we'd have a big problem, and I'd think of something that was creative and different, and I didn't think anybody in the room would support it. if I just lobbed it in the room, you know, and I always had more detail with it than just throwing it over the fence. But I would go to a couple colleagues that were also coming to the meeting and say, hey, I'm thinking about bringing up this idea, and this is what I think about it. What do you think about it? And get them enlisted in the idea and thinking it through, so that when I do raise the idea in the meeting, I would often have a couple people that would say, well, you know, on the surface it might be harebrained, but you know, as you think about it, it could be, you know, so I would always get a couple people that could advocate for me. I think another one, when you're the only woman in the room, is ensuring that your voice is heard, not by having to stop the meeting and say it over and over, but by being concise and clear, and to just have your ideas well formulated so that you can say, and you speak loudly and clearly and say, I have an idea. This is the idea. This is why I think it has value. This is how I think we could do it. I would need, you know, we would all need to do it together, support it. I mean, just to pull people into your idea to make it successful. And then the last thing I will say, in my career, and I know it will be different for everyone, but I was often taken out of an assignment that I absolutely loved, that I felt like I was making such a difference for the company. And after 3 or 4 years, they pulled me out and say, hey, go do this. You know, I was working Kazakhstan. They say, hey, go do this in Angola. And then I was working Angola. They said, hey, go do this in offshore Gulf of Mexico, and then to Asia. And every time you come into a new operation, you are the new leader and they know everything about the business. And so the extent to which you prepare to take on a big leadership role is very important. I used a tool called the 30, 60, 90-day plan, where I formulated what I wanted to do my first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. I sat down with my boss usually and said, what do you think? Do you think this is a good approach to the new job? And then I sat down with my leadership team and said, these are things I want to focus on. Give me input and let me know, you know, if these are the right things, and I'll adjust. But so that they were bought into how I took on the new job. And that took a lot of planning, but it also showed a lot of thoughtfulness around how important that job was, and how little I knew about the job coming in, and how much everybody needed to help me get to where I needed to be successful, and to enlist their engagement. So I would say it takes work behind the scenes to do those things. And it takes thinking instead of, you know, we're so inundated by 1,000 emails a day, but it takes time to step back from that mundane administrative work of your day and really think through, how do I create value? How do I innovate? How do I get people to come with me? How do I lead? And that time is so important for you to have spent it.
Well, this is incredible. And to put it in perspective, the men you got to support you and actually follow you that you were leading were in the Middle East, were in Asia, they were not in you know, what traditional countries where women are at the top or have top leadership roles. You're a very requested keynote speaker for many events, many organizations, because of your unique story, because you are a pioneer in a way. From your perspective and what you are seeing, what are the signs that we as women are on track to achieving parity across different industries?
Well, I think, and thank you for that comment. You know, my view is that I didn't have other role models to listen to or learn from. And I think how much I could have learned to be better and to be a better leader if I'd had opportunities like this. And I would just say to all of you that are called in or watching later, you know, every opportunity you can take to learn from others, and men and women. I'm not saying just the women, but I do think women have had some unique experiences in male-dominated fields. But taking those opportunities to learn and apply are important. So number one, there are companies that are working to achieve parity for women. They're trying hard. And this group I'm involved with on, it's a McKinsey initiative, but it's called Advancing Women Executives in Energy. We looked at what we thought were best practices in the industry about advancing women. And we boiled those down and kind of stripped them down and thought we needed to come up with best power practices, because the best practices aren't getting the results in the industry that we need. We're still the least diverse. So we are trying to, as women, share our personal experiences into what we think could be best practices to help other women. And one of those, and we came up with a diversity dashboard of 14 items, but one of those items for my industry is keeping women in line management roles. If you diverge out, as I said earlier, that is not a pathway to the CEO. If you want to have women on a pathway to the CEO and the ELT, they've got to stay in line jobs, and you've got to track their career across those line jobs to be sure they get there. So more dashboards, more milestones. Companies are doing that. If they, there's a minutia of 1,000 things they could do, but if they could boil down on a few things that really move the needle, then maybe we will move the needle. But our investors are asking for this. All of the investors in the energy industry are asking for, to share our ESG plans, our diversity, equity, inclusion plans, our pay equity plans, things like that. I think, as I said, sharing advice for people. When I retired from Chevron and moved into the board work, I had no knowledge of what to do to prepare for corporate boards. There were no sessions, no advice, no learning opportunities. There is today, just 6 years later, because there's quite a few of us that are communicating on those panels. So I've done a lot of speaking to women around how do you position yourself for board work, and what do you do 10 years before you retire to start positioning. I would have loved to have listened in on that. But I did pick a woman who I admire greatly, who is on boards, and I used her as my advisor when I was going into the board work. And that did help me tremendously, but I would have liked that. And then at the end of the day, for all of us and all of you that are listening, you work every day, you see problems every day. You're incredibly smart in fields outside your expertise. And you see opportunities to solve problems that make your company better, or to make your client's company better. And when you see those problems, you should always take a moment to step back and think, could I bring some solutions to that problem? Could I help solve it, even if it's not my responsibility, and get people on board to try? And it kind of goes back to, not being a victim. You can see a problem, you can always think, oh, well, this is the way it is, and this is the way they've always done things, and I can never succeed in that. Or you can say, look, I'm a problem solver. I can bring a solution to this. I'm not going to just raise issues, but I'm going to raise solutions. So bringing solutions to the table is so much more important than just saying, we've got all these problems, or we're a victim of these problems, or we're a victim of the way that things have always been done. So I do think that being a problem solver is really important for all of us, and it makes your company better, and it makes your team better, and you will be successful if you are seen as a problem solver and making things happen positively.
Well, it's incredible. Raising solutions instead of issues, or solutions in conjunction with issues, and having the courage to do that, even if it may not be the right solution. I think it's a great approach and advice. So what's next for Melody Meyer?
Okay, well, this is another thing I didn't think through until I was closer to retirement. So I would tell all of you to do this, and then I'll tell you what's next for me. So I never looked at my career to say, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? And now I tell people, you should design your career backwards. Take a moment every year to say, if I'm going to work till I'm 60 or 65, what job do I want to be in at 60 and 65? And what would it take to get to that kind of position or level that I'm really to me is successful. And success is different for everybody. It's not the same. It may be flexibility with family. It may be a position. It may be whatever it is, but think backwards from where you are today to where you want to be, and try to help navigate your career to get to that level of success that you want. So when I retired, I didn't look at my, I was in a fantastic job, loved what I was doing. I kept saying that I'll stay doing what I'm doing as long as I love it. And I was ready to move on. And then I realized that I should look at that career as phase one. So phase one was my Chevron career, and I started thinking about this world differently. And I'm in what I call phase two right now. So in addition to looking to where your career wants to be, that's your phase one. Then start thinking about, okay, what's my phase two? What do I want to do in phase two? So for me, phase two, I'm serving on corporate boards. I'm working with some startup companies. I'm advocating very heavily for the advancement of women. I'm writing a book, which is very slow going, but it is around leadership for women and some of my personal experiences. And I'm glad I haven't finished it, because I think my board service is an important part of that book as well. So I'm doing that. And then I have a phase three planned. So I'm thinking this is my phase two and phase three. And I just hosted a retreat for women corporate directors. And one of our evening conversations was, who is your future self, and what is the legacy you want to create? And these are women who are serving on big corporate boards, and we're thinking about phase three. And we all shared opinions about what is it that we feel like we want to be doing in phase three, because we're all going to live till what, 90, 97. So you ought to be thinking about, what is that phase three, and how do I make that very meaningful in my life and my family, my friends, and what I want to do. So for me, what's next for me is, I'm in phase two. I'm thinking about phase three. Phase three heavily involves my family, my grandchildren, and things that I want to do in phase three with my husband as well. And so I just think that that's important to do some planning. So I'm a planner, you can tell from what I've described, but I would encourage, and I didn't do personal planning until pretty late. So I'm just suggesting to all of you, do some personal planning early in your career.
Well, that's wonderful. I want to make sure we leave some time for the questions. I see, let me see what questions. I have some questions and then some comments. So, okay. Most men don't want to be seen as biased and want to be fair. What advice can women share with coworkers and well-intentioned male leaders when the topic comes up in conversation?
And one, I'd say just be really honest. A bias comes from men and women, and we all have it. And to be humble that I have my own biases, but I can give you some advice on your biases as well. But I think that always has to be done in private. I spent some time with a male colleague who feels like a huge ally for women. He's always advocating for women. But I observed in a meeting that he, when a woman's voice was not well communicated, and this was in the law field, and these were lawyers, he would acknowledge her idea and then expand on it himself and try to make it more clear for the group. And by doing that, he took the idea from her, and he didn't realize it. And I just said, look, what you're doing is completely the opposite of really what you want to do, I think. And I said, what you could have done is just to go back to her and say, I loved your idea. Can you expand on it and share it again to the group? But don't be the one to paraphrase it and to make it your own when you do it. And so in those times where you see a male colleague do it, have a chance to pull them aside, say, hey, I do this too, but one thing you could do better is, to frame it a slightly different way. And if he's a true ally, he's going to listen to that. That's going to be a meaningful moment, particularly coming from someone he respects. and if you do it in a respectful way.
Here's another question. Were the mails that you called out asking, why don't you call out the bias when it happens, open to that feedback? I'd like to understand your experience with male allies in general.
I think they were, you never really know, do you? So I think that it gets down to do it in a very respectful, appreciative way. And, one, I would say, look, I really appreciate you picking up on that. I picked up on it too, but you could have been the one to speak up. I did it sort of it doesn't have to be me. It's hard for me to do it, but if you do it, it really matters, because you're the voice in the room that needs to speak up on those things. So I do think it's all in the way that you say it as to whether or not the feedback is received. And I'm sure that some feedback that I've given may not have been received well, particularly when it was performance related. If you're in a performance conversation with someone who is not inclined to be open to feedback, you can imagine that those specific suggestions might not resonate well. But I think in the long run, people will go back and think about it and think, I think that's right. You have to be honest. Honest, transparency, candor, give some rationale and give some examples. People can't ignore that stuff.
I'm hearing we're seeing some really great feedback about your phase 2 plan. People find it very inspiring. And here's another question. Given how the energy industry is trending, what should be the top focus areas for women to make a strong business impact and grow and enjoy their career in the industry?
You might expect me to say move into the energy transition areas, which is true, but I would say we are working extremely hard in the conventional oil and gas to decarbonize and to make a big difference in our industry. So I think the key is to work across the industry in the base business and in our new emerging businesses, all with the view to advance lower carbon and to position the company for the energy transition. So if you do that in a way that is so focused on driving the economic returns and driving the low carbon businesses across the board, I just think that's the right place for us to be. And at the same time, ensuring that we have the best talent, and we need the best and brightest in this industry. We have big jobs and we have very big needs in the industry. And so we have to attract people that want to make a difference in the world and have the brains to do it. And I always say that one last thing on this is I think we all need to be what I call T thinkers, which is very deep in our technical engineering expertise, like engineering, math, science, communications, whatever. But you have to be broad in your ability to connect relationships, partnerships, economics, localization, to be able to, negotiate deals. So it's this thinking style, the T thinking style, that will make a big impact in our industry, because we have hard problems to solve.
What is the T thinking style? So broaden the ability to connect, and
this is the deep in your technical expertise, engineering, law, science, math, linguistics, but broad in partnerships, relationships, economics, AI, technology, to be able to intersect those two to solve the world's complex problems, I think is really an imperative for all of us. And to think intentionally about how to do that. How to be good, really good here, but also very good here.
I don't know how often, us as language professionals hear that outside of the engineering industry. For me, this was the first time, and it's amazing. The T thinking. It's another big note that I'm taking.
Can I use a quick example too? And this is a translation. So when I was in Kazakhstan, I had a wonderful interpreter that was that we picked to work together. She was my right hand. Everything we did was in 5 languages, and I brought her into every meeting, every leadership team, everything we did. She was at the table. She was not a technology person or an oil and gas person, but she learned it, and she learned it so well that this is the top of the T. And she was very good at relationships. And over time, I could just say to Tanya, would you go solve this issue? Do you see the issue? I know you know how to solve it, because she was so integral with the business. But it's that top of the T that she learned that was so invaluable to me. And I would just, that's just a great example of your field as to how you can combine those two.
That's wonderful. Do we have any other questions? And if not, I have one last question, then I'll hope right to the last question. So when you're starting and you may not know how to start, let's see if somebody else has a question before. Just absorbing and enjoying. Great. So when you're starting and you may not know how to start, or it may seem to be overwhelmingly big, I may not have a dream to be the CEO of, the president of British Petroleum or the largest language company in the world. Where do you start and how do you start? And what is a phase 1 or phase 2 plan? What's the first step?
So, your industry is different than mine, and you're going to have to translate this into how it applies to you personally. But I would say if you're 10 or 20 years into your career, 5 even, to say, here's the role I'm in, but these are the different roles with my experience that I could achieve in the next 30 years. And a CEO may not be what you aspire to. In fact, a lot of people don't aspire to that because it's a very different job than the one you start in. But to think about, what does it take? What jobs would I love to have when I'm 55, 60, 65? And where would I be making a big difference? It might even be outside your industry. It might not be, progression in your industry. But to think about it and think about, what are the skill sets, if I were to do that I don't have today, and how do I start mapping? So that's phase 1, looking at your career backwards. In my career, every 4 years you moved. So what is it in 14 jobs over every 4 years over that period of time? Where do you get to where you want to be? That's what I would do in phase 1. In phase 2, you should start thinking about 10 years before you retire from your phase 1. And be thinking about, what is it that I want to do next, where I can really add value. It could be nonprofits. It could be back with your university or back with school systems. But you will have an opportunity to make a big impact in phase 2. So think intentionally how to do that. And how do you get the skill sets that you need to be able to get there? So it's just a matter of being more intentional about your own career development, and being honest with yourself on what you're really good at and what you're not good at and what you need to learn. And lastly, just being a lifelong learner. Learn everything you can and listen to people and use their advice and apply it, and don't go back to the old ways of doing things.
Thank you so much. Thank you for an incredible presentation. I have 2 pages of notes. If people saw me looking down, I was doing note taking, and actually looking forward to your book coming out soon. Maybe we'll share it with the women in localization as well. So on that note, I think it's 12:01, so we're concluding the session. And
Thank you, Mila, so much for the opportunity. As I said, I really admire what you all do around the globe, and really appreciate the opportunity to share.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone who joined. Like mentioned, the webinar recording will be available shortly for our members. Thank you, Mila. Thank you, Melody. Thank you to the interpreters for providing ASL interpretation throughout this webinar. And we'll see you next time at our next events. Thank you so much, everyone.
bye-bye.